Tesler-Mabe. I am a musician and songwriter from Vancouver, Canada. I'm very excited to be here today to show you how to play a 12-bar blues in 10 levels. And of course, I think we can all agree, fundamentally, the blues is a type of music that comes from the expression of pain and sadness and joy and all sorts of deep emotion. But of course, it can be really wonderful to break down some of the chord choices or harmonic choices you can make when playing a blues just to take things to the next level. Maybe you're in a place where you're enjoying playing the blues, but you're looking for a little something, a little spice to add to it. And hopefully this could maybe give you some direction as to how to do so. I will be throwing around some theory here and there just because some of the higher levels might be more deeply understood if I do so. However, if you don't know theory, firstly, you could just look up anything you don't understand and you could learn that way, though I will try to sort of explain what I'm doing. If, let's say, you're not 100% sure what it is I'm talking about, you'll still be able to see all the chords I'm playing and hopefully you can follow along in that manner. So, without further ado, here is level 1, starting with some open chords. These are all dominant 7 chords, meaning they have a little bluesy flavor to them. And it's not usual in chord progression for every chord to be a dominant chord. However, this is where the blues kind of breaks the rules a little bit. And it sounds pretty cool and very bluesy. It sounds like this. So that was all using dominant chords. The first being this G7 chord, because we are in the key of G. And I'm just using my middle finger, putting that on the 3rd fret of the E string. Middle finger is on the 2nd fret of the A string. Everything else is open till we get to the high E string, where I'm putting my 1st finger on the 1st fret. That's what you would call our 1 chord, because that is the 1st chord of the chord progression, and also the home base of the key we're in, we could say, because we're in the key of G. This is a G chord, so it's our 1 chord. And then we go to what they call the 4 chord, because it is a 4th away from this root. That's an interval. And if you don't know what intervals are, I'd highly recommend looking into them because it's super helpful to know. But all you ultimately need to know is that this is a C7 chord, C dominant 7 chord. Those names mean the same thing. And if you happen to know your open C chord like this, all you have to do is add your pinky to the 3rd fret of the G string like this. You strum from the A string down, and there is our C7 chord. And we have one more chord right here, our D7 chord, which is our 5 chord, meaning because we're in the key of G, it's the chord that is a 5th away, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. D is our 5 chord, D7. And it's played with your middle finger on the 2nd fret of the G string, 1st finger on the 1st fret of the B string, and your 3rd finger on the 2nd fret of the E string. And you strum from the D string here down, and there it is. So just to talk through the form of a 12-bar blues, of course, as the name would imply, it is 12 bars in length. And so the most simple approach is to stay on your 1 chord, your G7, for 4 bars. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4. And then you're on C7 for 2 bars, and then back to G7 for 2 bars. D7 for 1 bar, C7 for 1 bar, and then you're back on G7 for 2 bars, and then the form restarts right there. And that's your 12-bar blues form in its most simple iteration. And so now I'll play it with bar chords. All right, so the question is, how do we play these bar chords? They are the same chords that we played before, G7, C7, D7. However, these are different voicings. A different voicing of a chord means that you're playing the same notes, but just in a different order, different permutation maybe, you could say. And so our G7 chord, what we're doing is barring with our first finger across all of the strings, which of course is what makes it kind of difficult because you have to force your finger to put enough pressure on all of the strings that they ring out. And that can be difficult at times when you're first starting. However, once you get the technique of how to play a bar chord down, it's very easy to play most bar chords from that point forward, because the hardest part is being able to do that in the first place, because it's physically very awkward to do. And we've all been there. All of your favorite guitar players, I'm sure, struggled with bar chords at some point. So you put your third finger on the 5th fret of the A string, and then your middle finger here is going to the 4th fret of the G string, and there's your G7 chord, and then your C7 chord. Now we're going to find the root on the A string. So when you're barring with your first finger, you're just barring from the A string down. And then you can put your third finger on the 5th fret of the D string, pinky, on the 5th fret of the B string, and that's your dominant 7 chord shape with the root on the A string. And you may have noticed a difference between these two chord shapes, and that's only because when you start a bar chord with the root on the E string, the actual shape of the chord will be slightly different than if you start it on the A string, and that's because of the way the guitar is tuned. The B string kind of messes everything up, because all of the strings are tuned in fourths, except for the distance between the G string and the B string is a third, which makes things a little more awkward, and that's why the shape changes a bit. But the good news is, the shape for C7 and D7 is the same as long as you start from the right root note. So C7 starts here at the 3rd fret of the A string, because that's where you find C. And D7 starts at the 5th fret, because that's where you find D on the A string. So there are your simplified bar chord blues. Nope, that's not good. So there are the bar chords you would need to play a blues all the way through. But let's not stop here. There's so much more we can do to keep adding color and flavor to what we're playing. Cool. All right. So the first difference may have been a little subtler, and that was actually in the first part of what I played. So I know I said before that you stay on the 1 chord for 4 bars before changing to your 4 chord. But here, what I added was called a quick 4, meaning you stay on the 1 chord for 1 bar, and then you go to the 4 chord, and then you come back to the 1 chord again for 2 more bars. So that's a really common move to throw into a blues. So sometimes you stay on the 1 chord for 4 bars before going to your 4 chord. Sometimes you stay on the 1 chord and you do a quick 4 after 1 bar and come back. At the very end, you may have noticed, I ended with this augmented chord right here. And this is such a classic blues ending. And the theory behind it is essentially when you're playing your 5 chord, there is something known as harmonic function, meaning the way the chords, or the purpose that the chords serve in the chord progression is very important to the way that you use them. So the 5 chord is usually used as a way to build tension before resolving back to your 1 chord. A 5 chord usually resolves back to the 1 chord. So it's very common to take your 5 chord and make it sound all freaky and altered, like this wonderful augmented chord. You take your 3rd finger and you put it on the 5th fret of the A string, because that is the root, just the same as that bar chord, same root. And then you take your middle finger and you put it on the 4th fret of the D string. And then you can bar with your 1st finger across the 3rd fret of the G string and B string. And augmented, the name of that chord, essentially is just saying that there is a note in that chord that is sharper than it normally would be. So instead of, you might recognize that as being a major triad. And an augmented chord, the 5th, which is normally here, is raised by 1. It's augmented, because the word augmented literally means to, what is the definition of the word augmented? Is it to raise? So after referencing the dictionary, to augment something is to increase it. So that would make sense, because we're increasing, raising that 5th by 1. So sometimes the names of chords actually make a lot of sense, and it's great when they do. So what changed here is the way that I'm playing these dominant chords. So for instance, this wonderful G7 chord, I was playing as a G13 chord. There are a few ways you could approach playing this. I think the easiest way, if you're planning to actually strum with a pick, would be to take your thumb and put that on the root note on the E string. And with your thumb, try to mute the A string, because we don't want that ringing out. And then you're going to take your 1st finger and have it on the 3rd fret of the D string. And then my middle finger is on the 4th fret of the G string. Pinky is on the 5th fret of the B string. And now the next voicing we were using for our C7 and D7 chords was this, which is a dominant 9, or a C9, D9. And so the way you play it, you have your middle finger on the 3rd fret of the A string. Your 1st finger is on the 2nd fret of the D string. And then you have your 3rd finger barring across the 3rd fret of the G, B, and E strings. However, what's interesting about this chord is sometimes it's difficult to have that D string ringing out, especially when you're barring with your 3rd finger this way. So it depends. If you want to get that sort of upper part of the voicing, you could play it this way and you might not have your D string ringing out as much. However, if you really wanted the D string to ring out, you could also play it this way with your 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the G string and your pinky on the 3rd fret of the B string. So you just won't get the 3rd fret of the high E string. So it's totally up to you. And same as before, I was using the quick 4 and that augmented 5 chord. All right, so what I added here was a sharp 4 diminished chord. Crazy, right? So basically what that means is anytime I go to the 4 chord, which in this case is C, dominant, I'm following it with this diminished chord, which is another very classic blues move, and I think sounds super, super great. Super great. And so after you play your 4 chord, you play this diminished shape where you put your middle finger on the root, right here, on the 4th fret of the A string. So then I'm barring with my 1st finger across the 3rd fret of all of the strings from the A string down, because it's going to fill in all of the gaps where these 2 fingers and this finger, these 3 fingers are not, so that we're not getting any open strings, because we don't want that. And so then you take your 3rd finger and you put it on the 5th fret of the D string. and then your pinky on the 5th fret of the B string. And if you can, if you're barring with your first finger, you could get the 3rd fret of the high E string as well with that barred finger. And just to loop back to what I said before when I called this a sharp 4 diminished chord, just as we talked before about how the augmented chord is when you take a 5th and sharpen it or raise it by 1, when I say sharp 4, I literally just mean that the root of the chord is a sharp 4 away from our root chord, which is of course G in this case, because we're in the key of G. And it creates a wonderful tritone interval, which would have you executed, I believe, in medieval times if you tried to use that interval in your music. But we have progressed so far since then, so we can use it all we want, especially in the blues. All right, so the next level, things are about to get very jazzy. So now we're sort of taking the next step from blues into a jazz blues, and this will really add a lot of sophistication to your sound. Not saying I'm sophisticated, but you could sound sophisticated, and I think that could be really a great next step for your blues playing. And what it would sound like is this. So what we added there was maybe the absolute bread and butter of jazz music, known as the 2-5-1. And just as we've been referring to our blues chords as 1-4-5, 2-5-1 is also referring to the intervals that tie together these chords. You may have heard the first 2-5-1 at this point in the blues, after I've played our 1 chord, quick 4. That's where the first 2-5-1 was. And so the way a 2-5-1 works is your 1 is, of course, your target note. So here, we're trying to get to the 4 chord. So that's actually the 1 in this 2-5-1 sequence. And so what this means is we find the note that is a major second, a 2 away from this note here. So that would be D, because D would be a second away from our target note. And we'll want it to be a minor 7 chord because you want your 2 chord to be minor in a major key. We have a D7 to this crazy G7 altered chord, and this is our 5 chord of our target note, meaning this is a 5th away. So like I said before, when you're on a 5 chord, you can really alter it and go crazy and make it sound like it has as much tension as possible, so it's great when you resolve it. So the way I'm playing this chord, I'm putting my thumb on the root, which is the 3rd fret of the E string, which would be where the root would normally be for our G7 chord. And then here I have my first finger on the 3rd fret of the D string. And now my middle finger is on the 4th fret of the G string. 3rd finger is on the 4th fret of the B string. And my pinky is on the 4th fret of the high E string. And when I say altered, what I mean is either the 5th note is flattened or sharpened, or the 9th is either flattened or sharpened. So we can see in this chord, we have a sharp 5 and a flat 9. And so that's why this sounds crazy and great to resolve, great to use to resolve to this chord. So there's our 2-5-1 sequence resolving to our 4 chord, which again would sound like this. I didn't explain the D7 chord. I should do that. I'm barring with my first finger across the 5th fret of the A string down, and then I'm putting my 3rd finger on the 7th fret of the D string, and then my middle finger on the 6th fret of the B string. You could also play it just by barring with your 5th fret across, 5th fret of all of the strings from the A string down. Now it's time to move on to the next level and add a turnaround to the end of the blues. So a turnaround is the way that you're turning around the chord progression to get back to the 1 chord when it restarts. And so what it sounds like is this. Sounds very nice. And so what this turnaround is 6-2-5-1. I'm throwing more numbers at you, I'm so sorry, which again is referring to the chord progression. And again, we think about what our target note is, which is our 1 chord at G7. So when I say 6-2-5-1, I mean, firstly, we're finding the 6 of our target note. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I just played up the major scale and I found our 6th note, which would be E. So we can find E right here on the 7th fret of the A string. And your 6th chord in a major key is going to be a minor 7 chord, or just a minor chord or a minor 7 chord. They have the same function in the chord progression. Let's make it minor 7 to make it a little jazzier. And so I'm just playing that again with our classic minor 7 shape that we went over earlier. Yeah, and then we're playing 2, 5, back to G. So again, 2, our 2 chord, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, our 5 chord, which we're going to alter the same way we have in the past with that flat 9, and we bring it back to G. So again, that turnaround sounds like. So the irony is this might actually be physically more easier to play than the last level, but it involves an extra step of understanding. And that's why I wanted to teach this level after our 2-5-1 level. And so now what we're going to be doing is when we're playing those 2-5-1s, we can add a tritone substitution. So we're coming back to the tritone. We are really tempting all of the medieval purists out there to really hate this music because we're just putting tritones everywhere. And so basically, the way a tritone substitution works is anytime you're playing the 5 chord, especially in a 2-5-1, you actually, instead of playing your G7 or G altered 7 chord, you'd actually play the dominant chord a tritone away. So in this case, that's our D flat right here. And we can play any dominant chord there. So I'm just going to play the dominant 9 chord that we've looked at previously, because then all we have to do is take this chord shape and move it down like that. And again, it's easier to play than the last level, and it sounds really cool. So again, what we'd have so far would be. That's our next tritone substitution. So instead of playing that crazy E7 flat 9 chord, we're going to play the chord a tritone away. And because of the way reharmonization works, I can make that a minor chord. You could also play that as a dominant chord if you wanted. But I really like the sound of that descending minor chord sequence because it's like in the classic blues standard Stormy Monday. You might recognize that. And now, like I said before, we can use a dominant chord in our tritone substitution. When we play our next 2-5-1 sequence, So instead of playing our D7 flat 9, we'll be playing the chord a tritone away. Like I said before, we could make this a dominant chord if we wanted to. And that's the way I played it in the example, because I really like the way it sounds. So we'd end up with. So I'm just taking that, dominant 13 chord that we've been using as our one chord, but moving it up a half step before bringing it back to our home bass one chord. So again, what this sounds like is. And I also ended this with this turnaround. And you might notice that these chords are all a tritone away from the chords we were using in our 6-2-5-1 sequence from before. So instead of playing, we have B flat, dominant 7, because that's a tritone away from E. And then this would actually be the same as before. We have A. We are not going to substitute it for its tritone substitution, but we will make it a dominant chord, because then you don't have to change your chord shape at all as you're descending. And then, instead of playing our D7 flat 9 chord, we're going to play the chord a tritone away. So A flat, dominant 7, and bring it back to our home bass chord, G dominant, whatever you want it to be. And the reason I say that is because I think I may have, in the example, played it this way, which is just adding a little extra color to the 13 chord we've already looked at, where we're adding a 9 to the top of the chord by putting our pinky on the 5th fret of the high E string. And you can do that for all of these chords if you choose to. It's totally up to you. This is just showing how many options you have. There isn't really a right way to do it, but this is where the creativity comes in, right? Favorite turnarounds ever. Again, based off of that 6-2-5-1 chord progression, sort of incorporating some very cool tritone substitution ideas, as well as some reharmonization that you might start understanding if you look to players like Joe Pass and Art Tatum and all of those people who are incredible at reharmonization. Anyways, this is a good place to start. So just like before, we're starting with our dominant 13 one chord. We're moving up to our B flat dominant 13, and of course that works because it's the tritone of our E minor 7. And then we're going to this chord here. This is the one that really makes me feel stuff. It's like, oh, that's a great chord change. And so what I'm playing here is an E flat major 7 chord. And so I'm barring with my first finger across the 6th fret of the A string and all of the strings underneath it. And then my 3rd finger is on the 8th fret of the D string. And then my middle finger is on the 7th fret of the G string, pinky on the 8th fret of the B string. And if you can bar with your first finger across all of the strings, then you'll also get that 6th fret of the high E there. And my guitar is just a little wonky in terms of the intonation because, after all, it is from the year 1966. And it just showed up recently, and I haven't had the chance to set it up yet. So I apologize to anyone out there who is thinking, that might be just a little out of tune. But that doesn't change the fact that this is such a great chord change. And then we go to an A flat major 7 chord. And the way I'm playing that is first finger is on the root of this chord, A flat, at the 4th fret of the E string. We're going to try to mute the A string again, as seems to be a very common theme in this lesson. And then we're adding our 3rd finger there on the 5th fret of the D string, and then our pinky on the 5th fret of the G string, and then middle finger on the 4th fret of the high E string. And if you can, I'd recommend muting the high E string, because Maybe not ideal, or maybe you want that kind of dissonance in your chord, but if not, I would avoid that. I would avoid the high E string. And again, that turnaround sounds like this. And I think it sounds awesome. But now, as I said earlier, actually at the very beginning of this lesson, blues is a type of music about expressing profound emotion. And at the end of the day, some of the greatest blues players, if not all of the greatest blues players of all time, it was about the feeling that they evoked in their playing. And I don't think that using beautiful chords will necessarily mean that you're expressing anything in your playing. So that's why level 10 is about just forgetting about the rules and just playing and just feeling what you're playing. And so I'm going to play a little bit for you. And I think that hopefully this conveys that if you learn the rules really well, you can forget about them. And that's sort of paraphrasing a principle that I've heard Victor Wooten talk about many times. Basically, this idea of you learn the rules so well that you can forget about them. And in the moment, just play, with all of your soul and all of your feeling. And so, yeah, let's just see what happens now.